Welcome to the Pacesetter Pod, where we explore and reveal the perspectives, insights, and approaches to deliver great results and growth in your agribusiness through better execution. Here's your host, the Integration Pacesetter, Joe Mosier.
Welcome, Pacesetters of Agribusiness, to another episode of the Pacesetter Pod. Thank you, as always, for choosing to spend your time with us today. Very briefly, before we get to today's episode, a quick reminder. Be sure to hit subscribe so that you never miss an episode of the Pacesetter Pod or any of the great content or conversations that we publish on your podcast player of choice every Wednesday. Okay, with that, I want to talk about something really important today that I continue to hear come up time and again in M&A clients that we're working with. Every single M&A transaction that involves buying anything more than assets or IP weights its success heavily on one factor, and that's customer retention. Retaining customers, retaining the sales that they generate, retaining the relationships that they represent to the market. This is core of so much of the acquisition and consolidation activity that we see in agribusiness every day. Some transactions do a phenomenal job of customer retention and completely outperform expectations. Others, as you would expect, really drop the ball. They end up alienating customers. And while that capital and that attention is all tied up in the acquisition, the competition, meanwhile, is busy scooping up all those disaffected or disoriented and maybe even disgusted customers that are eager to take their business elsewhere. Between those two extremes, I would say most acquirers fall somewhere in the middle. But having customer retention as a core objective of your post-close integration and monitoring it as an indication of transaction success, doing that sets you ahead of many people, but it still leaves a lot of opportunity on the table for your agribusiness over the long term. If customer retention within your M&A pursuits is one of those leverage points, a pivot point with outsized impact and overall M&A deal success, then we need to ensure that our thinking around the topic of customer retention is robust and really reflects the importance that we place upon that topic. And that's what I want to talk with you about today. And I'll do that through three specific lessons or observations that I think all of us can take into our next deals to get better success as it comes to customer retention. Now, the first point that I want to share today is you cannot assess the success of customer retention and your plans if you don't define what you want. Let me say it again. You can't assess the success if you don't define what you want. It's painfully obvious when you say it out loud, but it shows up time and again. We value customer retention. Retaining the existing book of business is going to be critical to how we make sure this is a successful transaction for both the buyer and the seller. All these sort of platitudes, statements, and communications that come out, but we need to go a bit deeper than that. So a few thoughts and observations on this particular point. There's no absolutes when it comes to retention, and it's unlikely that you're going to retain 100% of both legacy businesses. Just be honest with yourself. Buyco has a book of business. Sellco has a book of business. Every year there's customer churn. Nobody retains 100% unless you simply do not have competition in the marketplace, which would be rare. And so you need to consider the fact that customer churn is going to happen. So determine what a difficult to reach but reasonably achievable target is, and then work towards that. Maybe it's saying we want to retain 90% of the book of business. Or benchmarking says 75% is world-class, we're going to go for 80%. Whatever it is, you need to go deeper than just saying retain the book and actually set the target. But even more than that, you got to get nuanced when you're defining it. And what do I mean by that? Not all customers are created equal. And if they're not all created equal, you need to weight them accordingly in how you think about retention. So this is not just about the volume of sales or the revenue that a customer represents, but it's also things like, think about the longevity of the relationships of your customers. You might have one account it's a big account, represents a lot of potential sales, but maybe you've only had 1 or 2 seasons of activity with them. Maybe they're actually a relatively new customer and you don't know what the long-term stickiness of that relationship is. Maybe they came to you because of supply disruption with their legacy supplier. And once those wrinkles get ironed out, they're going to be right back. You need to compare that huge customer with 1 to 2 year sales history with maybe a moderate to bordering on large account that you work with, but you've got 10 years of history. You need to think about the durability of those sales over time, not just as a new customer or old customer, but for the old customer, how have those sales been holding? Have they been holding steady year to year? Do they trend up and to the right over time? Or are they choppy at best? And maybe on an average basis, they become a strong contributor to your business year on year, but in a given season, it's going to be highly inconsistent. And maybe they come to you 1 year and really represent a lot of sales and a lot of opportunity, and you barely hear from them the next year, right? So the kind of the trajectory and the stickiness of that relationship over time needs to also factor into how do you weight your customers in it in terms of a retention plan. You also need to look at your book of business, both from Buyco and Sellco, and think, what are the long-term prospects of this customer segment, right? Do they reflect a strategic channel that's going to really drive growth for the next 5 to 10 years? Or is this a known, familiar, well-liked customer that they sit in a contracting segment that's just going to continue to lose volume and lose traction over time? These are things you need to think about. And again, not all customers are created equal. Now, in this overall analysis of defining retention as part of your acquisition, whether you land on the percent of customers retained, or maybe customer retention actually means we're going to talk about volume retention, some different types of metrics there. You also need to consider the performance expectations on a year-on-year basis. And here's what I mean. The prevailing, I don't know if it's prevailing knowledge, but the prevailing assumption is that if you defend your book of business and get your retention results, whatever they might be, through the first sales cycle that's post-acquisition, then you're in the pole position, and it'll be relatively easy to defend and extend that into the next one. But I see time and again that there's times when the timing of your transaction, when you buy a business, the customers that would transact with that legacy business that you've now acquired, sometimes the timing of the deal, of the announcement and of the close limits the options available to them. They might frankly be hamstrung by the seasonality of their business, of the product or service you supply to them. And they might just, in the context of that sort of timing constraint, they might be unwilling to hit the reset button at that time of year when they're placing orders. And they might just choose to say, we're going to ride with you for the first year. All the while, we are very closely evaluating our options as we look into year 2, which means you could have a very successful year 1 with a set of customers and feel like their activity with us this year reflects the multi-year activity that they had prior to the acquisition. Things are going well. We didn't lose any business, but all the while they could be getting ready to jump ship because they were already had some pre-existing conditions where they were looking for an opportunity to move. The acquisition and the disruption, the perceived disruption, triggered an analysis for them to go look outside. And again, you might be blind to this. And so look at retention over a multi-year time frame and talk to the customers. And don't take this year's sales for granted as being indicative or predictive of what next year's sales will look like. So if you consider the fact that year 1 retention is not predictive of year 2, then again, you can plan around that and you can sustain retention that might otherwise have been at risk. The overall idea here is that you have to have a surgical analysis of the book of business and just not fall victim to the idea of tallying retention in very simple terms. Now, one last thing I want to say in this first point of defining retention is the notion of turning over your book of business. We all know that sometimes customers outgrow our businesses, or sometimes we outgrow theirs. And eventually, tough decisions will need to be made about how you serve them, if you serve them. And to be less sensitive, this is kind of the culling of the herd that needs to happen periodically to ensure that you have a customer set that uniquely benefits from the value that you deliver and are really positioned to be long-term partners in your growth as well. This is a very healthy activity. I think it doesn't happen often enough, but I would also caution that immediately post-acquisition is not usually the best time to undertake a customer review and start making these adjustments. But in the process of defining retention, of weighting the customers that you care the most about, the ones that you want to focus a lot of time and attention on, make sure that they are heard, that you're connected with them, and that you can create a long-term relationship with them post-close. In the process of doing that, you can maybe start to flag some of the customers, some of the segments, some of the counterparties that are maybe quote-unquote less strategic customers. And then indirectly, you start to align on who you are more comfortable with losing in the process. So again, I wouldn't aggressively go into a culling process with your book of business post-acquisition. But I do think that in the ways that you evaluate your book, evaluate the book of the company that you acquired, and the way you look at the totality of that, you can start to make some categorization of strategic or less strategic customers, which will start to put that in motion, but be really balanced to the amount of time and capacity you have in the moment. This is all predicated on the idea that attention to your customers is not an infinite resource, and time not invested in one place can be allocated elsewhere. And if it's done properly, that's all the better if it reflects, creating your ideal book of business. Now, that's a lot on define what you want, define what retention means.
Poorly executed mergers and acquisitions destroy more value than they create. They can set your company back years. To defend your firm's position in the marketplace, you need access to the leading practices that unlock the greater potential of your people, processes, and systems. If you are undertaking a company transformation or pursuing an acquisition as a vehicle to grow, set up a call with Joe by visiting www.moshercg.com.
But number two, kind of conversely, is really important. The second observation here is you don't want to anchor your deal success as it relates to customers solely on retention. You don't want to be too narrowly focused only on retention. So think about it this way. Buyco has a book of business and Sellco has a book of business. And when Buyco acquires Sellco, you bring them together, right? But the reality is there's probably a premium that was paid to acquire Sellco. And so premiums that are above the actual enterprise value of the organization that are necessary to close the deal, they don't pencil out if you have a simple combination as the expected outcome. And what I mean by simple combination is 1 + 1 can't equal 2 if you paid a premium on the deal. Deal math doesn't work like that. Deal math needs 1 + 1 to equal 3 or 4, maybe in time 5. And that talks about the growth potential of these acquisitions. Now, maybe you've got a transaction where there's some significant synergies. Maybe you're going to have a lot of savings on storage and distribution. Maybe you're going to get some procurement leverage for better pricing when you source products. Maybe there's some technology or some personnel efficiency gains, whatever those are. So maybe in that situation, 1 + 1 minus 0.5 equals a 2.5 net gain. So maybe there's some times where it does work closer to this. But again, you need to think about the fact that you do this acquisition with a mind towards creating something bigger than just the sum of the parts. Or at least you should be thinking that way. Again, the reason I mention this is that both companies, prior to your deal, they had plans to service their existing book of business and then to expand it, right? To attract additional customers, to do more business with their existing customers. Anything they could to not stay stagnant, to not stay where they were at that time. Every business is seeking growth, is seeking change and scale over time. Bringing those companies together is exciting. And for all those reasons we mentioned, customer retention is terribly important, and a focus on retention needs to be there. But a focus on retention cannot preclude you from having that bigger vision for the future, of having a vision and then articulating that through a plan of action that creates new customer growth, that creates new expansion for the organization, that creates more that exists by somebody putting company A and company B together. 1 + 1 = 2 does not work with M&A. Now, some M&A deals are defensive in nature, meaning you're actually trying to hold off the expansion of another business. And that's kind of one of the core drivers, perhaps. And so maybe in that case, buying that book of business as a blocking tactic to other competition does work in the short term. But really, in most cases, and arguably even in defensive maneuvers, acquisitions are about growth. If it's not about growth, why would you take on all the pain and the turbulence and the risk? And so this growth needs to be reflected in your customer plans. Know what your present state is. Know what retention needs to look like, but don't become trapped by only looking at retention of what exists today. And that brings us to the third and final point that I wanted to share with you. And that's that you need to observe and act while you're armed with a clear view of why things are as they are today. And that's kind of a mouthful, but what good are any goals around retaining existing business? Losing some accounts, acquiring other accounts, growing the pie. What good is it if you lack the insights about what created the situation on the ground today? Really, how can you credibly plan the right moves and reliably predict the outcomes of those moves if you don't understand why the two businesses prior to transaction were in the state that they were in? So there's an old adage that I've probably said on this show many times before, but I learned it when I first joined the grain business in a process improvement role a number of years ago. And the adage was meant to help slow us down from making any unspoken assumptions and protect us from creating self-inflicted wounds by focusing on the wrong problems or seeing issues where maybe they didn't exist. And the adage was, you never tear down a fence until you know why it was built. And the reason you don't do that is because you ought to know if that fence was put there to keep something out or to keep something in. There's a reason someone put a fence here. You might not want the fence there. It might not be the direct placement of the fence, might not be the right materials, might not be the right height, might not be the right design. Whatever it is, there's a reason that fence is there. And it behooves you to know why it is. And that idea applies here to customer retention. Why do your legacy customers do business with you, whether you're on the buy side or the sell side? And similarly, why have other customers in the past elected to not get on board with you? What has prevented you from serving other customers? You can put together the most crisp, the most refined, the most, truly world-class customer retention and growth plan. You can have all those things developed and in place. They can be based on your value proposition. They can be looking at your manufacturing capabilities. They can be, really leveraging your marketing prowess, your distribution expertise, whatever it is. But if you don't really know what's keeping some of your customers in and what's keeping others out, how good are those plans? How reliably can you set a realistic customer retention goal? How credibly can you create a vision for the future about how the combination of these two companies can create more and different opportunities for the market and create value that you can deliver and then participate in with your customers? All these things work together. And so you really need to know why it exists as it does today, that sort of raw postmortem analysis of what got us here, and then use those insights, the good and the bad, the convenient and maybe the less comfortable realizations that come out of that. Knowing those things and then putting them into those plans helps increase not only the reliability of your plans, but the likelihood of your success. So let's briefly recap what we covered today. Customer retention is critical to M&A success. Everyone knows that. And if somehow you didn't know that before today, now you know too. But in addition to customer success being critical, retention needs to be defined in order for it to be truly additive to your business and actionable as a plan. Similarly, you have to resist the urge to only play defense in retention and make sure that while you're focused on retaining the customers that you want and need, you're also focused on the customers that you have not yet served. Focus on the company you want to create and the wider portion of the market that you hope to be able to capture and build relationships with. And then finally, any of these plans that you develop, they have to be anchored in an understanding of why your customers work with you now and what you can do to attract others. Anytime you can invest in understanding that is going to be time well spent. So I hope that was of value to you today. Again, this just comes up time and time again. We're in the middle of this cycle where deal activity is picking up. Co-op consolidations continue to happen. Smaller companies are looking at more acquisition activity than they have in the past. And so much of the value drivers that I see in project charters that we work on really center around, customer retention, customer retention, customer retention. And as we ask these questions, what do you mean by customer retention? What beyond retaining existing customers do you want to create with this deal? Why do you have the customers you have today, and why don't you have others? Those questions really inspire a lot of rich debate within our client organizations. And I wanted to share this with everyone because I think it's timely, it's relevant, and it's really important for you to think about. So I hope it was of value and relevant to you today. Again, I never take the time you spend with us listening to this podcast for granted, and I hope that it was of value to you. And if it was, one very simple request: please consider sharing it with others who you think would find similar benefit from it in their agribusiness. It's the single best way that you can support this show and make sure that we get the word out to improve and elevate thinking around strategy execution in agribusiness. With that, thank you for listening, and I look forward to having you join us again right here on the Pacesetter Pod.
This is thepodcastfactory.com.